The story of Final Fantasy XIV. The community has a very strong opinion that the story of the game is a massive component of the game and that if you skip it, you're essentially skipping a vast majority of the game or you're missing out on a huge piece of it. I have my own experiences having gone through the game, both skipping and paying attention to various points of the game, and I wanted to give you some perspective as someone who's done a bit of both. Am I full of regrets, or do I not really care? Do I want to go back and experience everything with New Game Plus, or do I feel like I got my fill? Do I still have fun playing the game despite having skipped a decent amount of the story? Let's find out. For reference, this is going to be a spoiler-free video, so if you haven't actually played the story of the game, I'm not going to reveal anything to you that's important. I know that's important to a lot of people, so just know that I won't spoil anything in this video. But we're going to start with a Realm Reborn. As you know, the game is broken out across many different expansions. We have a Realm Reborn, which was the base game, then we have Heavensward, then we have Stormblood, and then we have Shadowbringers. Each of them has their own self-contained story within them, and I think that when it comes to a Realm Reborn, the game very much feels like a game that's trying to figure itself out. The questing progress in the game feels very lackluster, very uninspiring. It's a lot of go here, talk to that person, go there, talk to that person, go here, talk to that person, teleport there, then talk to that person, then go there, give that person that thing. It's a lot of that. And the game is constantly talking at you as you do it. It's introducing new characters, it's trying to set up a different plot line. It's doing a lot of things as it's doing all this, but the gameplay portion of this is pretty monotonous. So basically, a Realm Reborn, the story is kind of the only thing in it. The gameplay of Final Fantasy XIV throughout, I think, is incredible as far as the combat system goes, as far as the world, as far as the different options available to you within the glamour systems, the different mounts that you can get, the fun dynamics within dungeons. All of that stuff is incredible. But a Realm Reborn really tests your mettle as a player. Can you survive a Realm Reborn is an important question when it comes to your longevity in Final Fantasy XIV. The story is just... it's rough. I'm not gonna lie, it's really rough. It's hard to sit there and watch it. I read online, as I'm sure you guys may have, you stumbled across this video, that says the story in Final Fantasy XIV is incredibly important. So obviously you want to be a good player of the game and you want to watch the story. But the game is really making it hard for you in a Realm Reborn. And the good news is that this isn't the case forever, but it is very much the case in a Realm Reborn. So when it came to a Realm Reborn, I actually didn't pay attention to pretty much any of the story. I would literally just blast through every cutscene. It didn't matter if it was just text. It didn't matter if it was, a more animated cutscene with text. If it was voiced over, I would probably watch a little bit of it, but then I'd potentially skip it anyway. So when I got to the end of a Realm Reborn for the ending piece, I did watch that entire cutscene because I knew I had reached the end of the game. And I thought it was incredible. I thought the ending of the game was incredible. However, what I had to do to prep myself for the ending was I actually found story snippets online that gave me a catch-up as to basically what's going on in the game. Because when it came to prioritizing my time within Final Fantasy XIV, my goal was get to the end game. I know the end game is where I enjoy games the most. That's where I have the most fun. I love optimizing my gear. I love to do all the hardest content. That's where I find fun in MMO games. But a Realm Reborn is this massive hurdle to getting there because it really beats you down as a player if you do not care at all about the story. The gameplay, progression is really rough. The dungeons are always incredible, fighting is always incredible, just leveling up and experiencing your class is great. All of the game part is good, but the way it's making you get to the end of the first expansion really hurts. So my recommendation for a Realm Reborn is if you are somebody that loves story in a game, enjoy yourself. Take the time, watch the cutscenes. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of story. There's a lot of characters. They're all using funny words that you've never heard of before. It's good. The story part is there, but there's a lot of it, and it really did admittedly beat me down. I was not willing to sit there and make a Realm Reborn last many hours more than I needed it to, because you can feel it very quickly. The great news again is that once a Realm Reborn is over, the ending is incredible. So for what it's worth, I'm going to link a channel that I use down below. It's the Comic Storians channel. He gives beautiful retellings of the entire story of the game. So I would basically watch one of those videos for A Realm Reborn in this instance, up to the point where I was, stop that video, and then experience the cutscene for myself. So I'd have a decent understanding of what's going on, who are the characters, what are their motivations. I could spend 10 minutes watching this YouTube video to catch up on the story, instead of sitting there in-game for hours and hours and hours watching all this stuff play out. Did I shortchange myself a little bit? Yeah, definitely. I mean, there were things that were happening in that ending that I didn't fully grasp or understand. However, the weight and the impact of the ending is still there, so I still felt it. So it comes down to personal preference when it comes to A Realm Reborn. There's a lot the game asks of you in terms of paying attention to story and sitting through it and watching it and reading it. If you're somebody that really enjoys that kind of stuff, there's plenty of that to go around. And if you're somebody that isn't, like myself, for instance, I would recommend doing as I did, which is going to the Comic Storian page, watch his recap video, pause it to wherever you are in the game if you want to watch a cutscene, and then watch the cutscene. The ending of A Realm Reborn is worth watching by a long shot, and you'll know when it's there. So make sure that you do watch that one at a minimum. This really sets the tone for where the game is going to go. That is my strong recommendation when it comes to A Realm Reborn. Again, personal preferences, but for me, I was not willing to suffer through the entirety of A Realm Reborn and the very boring quest progression, jump here, jump there, talk to this person. Not for me. So this is my recommendation to you if you're someone like myself. The story is good. The ending of A Realm Reborn is good. So I would not want anyone to miss out on that. But if you're someone like me who doesn't want to suffer through the endless numbers of cutscenes and quest text dialogues, read the recap, watch the recap, and you're good to go. Then we get to Heavensward. So Heavensward, if you ask around online, is universally praised as having a very good story, whereas A Realm Reborn I think really had a very good story at the end, and there was some major beats in the middle that were interesting. Heavensward is kind of interesting throughout, is the general perspective. And I would generally agree with this. Because of the way A Realm Reborn ended so strongly, I was much more willing to give the game more of my time for the story beats, because I could now tell that the game's story does pay off in really interesting ways. And I was slightly annoyed that I skipped as much as I did when I saw the ending of A Realm Reborn, because it was so impactful. I'm somebody who gets very emotional when I watch anything. I will be the first to cry in a movie theater, for instance. I'm not ashamed to admit this. So Final Fantasy XIV has a ton of moments that really tug at the heartstrings, and the ending of A Realm Reborn really, it got me good. So I was in for Heavensward, where I was watching the vast majority of the cutscenes. I would even read a lot of the quest text as I was running through. I dedicated a lot more time on focusing on the story. And I think it was also a very good experience. I wasn't willing to sit there forever and watch something. If I could tell a cutscene was dealing with some little side thing, I didn't give it a bunch of time or notice, so I would skip those. But if I could tell it was something that was more plot specific, like something that was more capturing my attention, I gave it the time. And I went through Heavensward very quickly, as I did with A Realm Reborn, but at least when I got to the ending of Heavensward, I was much more attuned with what was going on, why it was important, the impacts of those moments. I was more there for it. Still, as I did for A Realm Reborn, I watched the comic story and recaps just to make sure I didn't miss anything, so any of the blanks that I might have had got filled in. But for the most part, I was there along for the ride, and I also thought that was a very enjoyable experience. And I think Heavensward as an expansion handles the story much better than A Realm Reborn did. A Realm Reborn, again, feels like it's really dragging on as you're going through it, whereas Heavensward is a much more focused piece of content. I think the game designers also did a better job of making the gameplay as you're progressing through the story be more interesting. It built the story into your quest progression in a way that didn't feel like it was killing you as you were doing it, as it did in A Realm Reborn, at least for me. So if you're someone who loves story, Heavensward has, I think, a much more tightly packed, much more interesting, a lot more engaging story available for you. If you're someone who wants to skip them, by all means, feel free to skip the cutscenes and watch the comic story and recaps as I did. I think you can still have a very fulfilling experience for that just as well. Again, the gameplay of Final Fantasy XIV to me is so strong that the story is there. You know, it's a beautiful bonus if you're into it. But if you just love the gameplay and you just want the gameplay, I think the gameplay stands alone on its own and is incredibly worth investing into once you get to the end game. The gameplay is very strong and can hold you and very much stands up on its own. So if you want to skip the story, by all means, just watch the recap. I always recommend at least watching the endings. Watching the recap and then watching the ending in-game to me is always like the best middle ground between the story and the gameplay players. I think that's the happy medium, at least that's where I always landed, and I felt like I had a really, really good time. So Heavensward, thumbs up on the story, thumbs up on the gameplay. I think it's a great expansion and something that you should probably invest a little more time into paying attention into what's going on, because again, the world building is very much taking place, going on. The game is really coming into its own at this point. Then we get to Stormblood. I was very into the story, as I mentioned, during Heavensward, so I gave Stormblood a real good, honest try when it came to the story, but I found that the story was very much not something that I was interested in kind of at all, like pretty much literally at all. As I mentioned before in the Realm Reborn section, the Scions are usually like my central hub for things that I care about, and the story around Stormblood is very much dealing with other stuff. Dealing with the politics of another group of people, introducing a bunch of different nations and the leaders within, and dealing with their story. So for me, I was very checked out at this point. So I think once I realized that the main plot was going to revolve around things that I wasn't personally invested in, didn't really have a care for, I kind of checked out for Stormblood more or less universally. So for that one, I basically just brute force cut every single cutscene in half or all together. I just didn't watch them. Towards like probably 15 to 20% through Stormblood, I just gave up on cutscenes. I just was not interested. So I ended up skipping everything in Stormblood up until, again, the ending, and then I caught up with my comic story and recaps, and then I played through the ending, and I had a fine experience. Like, the Stormblood expansion gameplay, as I've said before, in all of these expansions is always great, so getting through Stormblood wasn't so bad. Again, it was the story part that didn't capture me in any capacity, so personally I skipped that one entirely. So at this point, I've gone through A Realm Reborn and Stormblood, more or less skipping everything and then watching recaps and then watching the endings, and then Heavensward I dedicated the time to actually watching the story. I think I had a great time throughout. Like, I was not having a bad time. Like, when I was dedicating more time to the story, did I think it was better time spent than when I was just skipping it? Honestly, no, because it always comes down to personal preference with this stuff, right? Like, if it's interesting to you, then it's interesting to you and it's worth your time. If you're not finding it interesting, why would you waste your time watching something like this? I know the community tells you it's extremely important, and if you mention at all online, whether that's in YouTube comments or in Reddit threads, that you don't like the story or you didn't watch the story, you can, see the flood of hate that's going to fly in your direction. And who knows, maybe this video will get a ton of downvotes for even saying something like this. But I think it really comes down to personal preference. What do you enjoy in a video game? For me, the gameplay is always the biggest piece of it, and I think, again, Final Fantasy XIV does that incredibly. But the story of Stormblood just didn't capture my attention, so I was pretty much checked out again entirely with the story in Stormblood. When it wrapped up, thought it was fine. The ending of Stormblood was totally okay. It just existed. But again, it just became a hurdle to the end game for me. It didn't feel like something that captured my attention or I cared about. It was just another hurdle like A Realm Reborn was to get to the ending. So, Stormblood, if you're just into generally, good story, then maybe Stormblood will be for you. For me personally, I was invested in a specific set of characters, and since this story didn't really have much to do with them, I didn't really care much about the story. It felt like a side episode, in like a Star Trek or something like that, where we're dealing with some weird stuff on some other planet. It's kind of like, I don't care about this. I just want to know if Captain Picard and, the Doctor Lady are going to get together or something like that. That's more what I'm interested in. So Stormblood felt very much like a little side mission to me versus a main plot beat. So I skipped it. And I don't regret it when it comes to Stormblood. I think I didn't miss much, and it doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the story going forward. And if it does, I've at least watched the recap, so I know who all the people are. The story's done in a way where you're basically forced to learn who the characters are anyway through the quest progression, so it's not like I wouldn't know who anybody is. It's more just I'm not personally invested in their progress. If they all died in a cutscene, I literally would not feel anything. And again, this is someone who cries during everything. I just don't care about these characters. So Stormblood, not for me. I skipped it. Didn't miss it. Don't regret it. Moving on. Which finally brings us to Shadowbringers. Oh, Shadowbringers. Shadowbringers, from a story perspective, I think is easily the best story that the game has to offer by far. For me, it landed on all of the notes that I loved. It had like mystery and intrigue, but it also had this like epic power dynamic that it introduced. It was largely focused around the characters that I cared about, and it presents the story throughout like in a very meaningful way. Like, I was emotionally impacted at multiple beats in the story for the entire Shadowbringers expansion, especially all the way up to like even the post-patch content. Shadowbringers to me was perfect. Like, the story landed in so many great ways, and it, pulled me in like pretty immediately. Like, I had heard from, online random nonsense that the story in Shadowbringers is good, and I had some like sense of like, how good it was. So I invested the time again, and it wasn't very hard to give it my attention. The environments that it introduces, like the world that it pulls you into, it pulls you in naturally. So, I mean, even as someone who was, gone through Stormblood and was emotionally killed, like as in I was going to be the guy who didn't care about story anymore, Shadowbringers pulled me right back into the fold. So I was fully invested in the story for Shadowbringers. I think I watched every cutscene. I watched, I read all the quest text as much as I could. I was in, and I was heavily rewarded for it. The story throughout, I think, has all of these great beats. The new character that gets introduced later on, or at least initially, really good. Emotional payoff is just there. Like, I can't say enough good things about it. Like, I'm smiling thinking about like how impacted I was as I was running through. Like, there were multiple moments where I like grabbed my chest and was like, shuddering to speak, because I was just so like invested in what was going on screen the entire time for all these cutscenes. I think the, overarching villain that it introduces is incredibly well played out. I think their motivations are very cool. I thought the whole story of Shadowbringers was great. So, I mean, Shadowbringers is such a great, introduction to the end game, because it leaves you on such a high once you're left, at level 80 in the world of Eorzea doing stuff. I don't think the game could have done a better job of like leaving you on such a great note to be in the end game. So for me, my experience throughout the entirety of Final Fantasy XIV, from level 1 all the way to level 80, I had a great time throughout, and I'm having an even more amazing time just playing the game now at the end game. All the Savage content that I'm running into, all the extreme dungeons that I'd never done before, leveling up other characters' jobs that I'd never really played before. Everything about the game, the part that I wanted to get to, is finally here, and it's great. It's everything that I hoped it would be. And I think the progression through it, it had its moments. Heavensward, I think, was particularly strong, and I think Shadowbringers by far was incredibly strong. The end of A Realm Reborn, I think, was incredibly good as well. So from a story perspective, the game gives and it takes. Maybe the entire story will be good to you. Maybe none of it's good to you. I think that comes down to you. But I think if there was any story that you should give a chance to, it would be Shadowbringers, because it really, really, really lands it. 10 out of 10, incredible. I think that's worth your time. And there you have it, my perspective on everything from the story in Final Fantasy XIV. Again, as someone who experienced all of the above when it comes to either paying aggressive attention to it or completely skipping it, I think I did a good job of balancing it personally in a way that I don't have any regrets. I feel no compulsion to go through New Game Plus to pick up the little bits that I may have missed. I think I got the gist and the payoffs for everything that I decided to pay attention to in Heavensward and Shadowbringers, and I do not miss the story that I potentially didn't get fully in A Realm Reborn and Stormblood. Don't have any regrets. So no motivation personally to go through New Game Plus. But of course, if you do, New Game Plus is always an option for you. And if you want to do a story skip potion by buying that on the Mog Station, I don't think you're going to miss a ton. Like, especially if you're the type that bought the potion in the first place to get to the end game, your goals are pretty obvious at this point. Getting to the end game is your goal, so I don't think the story beats that you missed up to that point are really going to hurt you. I do believe that if there was any expansion that you had to pay attention to or wanted to or is worth your time, Shadowbringers would be it. I think the story payoff in that is incredible, all the beats are incredible. Everything about Shadowbringers to me has been nothing but pure delight and joy and emotional impact. Could not recommend it enough. But that's my perspective on Final Fantasy XIV as somebody that's jumped through both skipping everything and watching everything. I think either are completely viable, and it is entirely dependent on what is capturing your interest and what your goals are. That's it. I love you guys as always. I'll catch you in a future video. Happy hunting.